So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this, for this overview of the FY24 SOA Plans. I'm Karen Johnston, and I'm the Student Opportunity Act Coordinator. And for many of you, I've been the public face of the Student Opportunity Act for a number of years. As I mentioned just a moment ago, before we get started, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slide deck will be posted on the SOA District Resources webpage. And we're aiming to have those posted by the end of this week. Throughout the course of the webinar, feel free to share questions in the chat throughout. And two of our key SOA team members, who I'd like to introduce now, will post replies wherever they can and occasionally drop links into the chat. They are Erica Champagne, who directs DESE's Office of Effective Practices within our Center for School and District Partnerships, and Kinnan Foley, a strategic advisor to the Commissioner's Office. We're also pleased that Kamal Basin, DESE's Chief Schools Officer, who leads the Center for School and District Partnerships, is here with us today. And finally, I said this a moment ago, but if you've just joined us and you haven't done so already, just let us know your name and what district you're from in the chat so that we know who's joining us today. Here's an agenda for today's webinar, which will give you a feel for the ground we're going to be covering. We're going to lead with a brief overview and background of the Student Opportunity Act, because we know not everyone has been involved with the SOA previously, and it doesn't hurt to offer a refresher. That will be followed by a high-level overview of the SOA plan elements and FY24 updates. We'll then go into the plan submission guide in some detail. And following that, we'll describe some of the supports that DESE will be providing to support districts during the plan development and submission process. And time permitting, we'll have an opportunity to address any questions that Erica and Kinnan haven't already answered in the chat. And we won't talk about contact information, but there is a slide that has that information at the end of the slide deck. So we wanted to start by taking a moment to share the overarching goal of the Student Opportunity Act, which is to ensure that every student in the Commonwealth has access to a high-quality public education, regardless of the zip code that they live in. And there are two primary components the legislation uses to address and support equitable outcomes. The first being fiscal changes to Chapter 70 funding, and the second, policy updates that set expectations for the state and districts to focus on addressing disparities in learning and learning experiences and outcomes for student groups that are least well served. On the policy side, the legislation includes a requirement that every district in the Commonwealth develop a plan to address disparities for student groups in their districts through the implementation of evidence-based strategies, approaches, and programs. And these are the plans that we're going to be discussing today. On the fiscal side, the SOA is an enormous new investment and ongoing investment in education on the part of the state. The legislation adopted all the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission in October 2015, in a report they produced in October 2015. When they did that, it committed to adding well over $1 billion in new education funding by 2027, designed to address the state's overall underinvestment in education. Since FY21, the state has increased funding for Chapter 70 programming by $1.3 billion. And in the FY24 budget that Governor Healy signed, there was a $594 million increase, 9.9% increase in Chapter 70 funding over FY23 levels. That increase in education funds is coupled with a revised funding formula that adjusted the formula in ways that recognized that some of our districts have been historically underfunded, and the goal was to fund them more equitably. So this set the stage to accelerate gap closing by providing more funding for students who need more services, like multilingual learners, students with disabilities, and students living in poverty. It also not related to student groups, it also increased the cost of healthcare, basing costs on up-to-date health insurance trends. Before we go any further, I do want to take a moment to address two common misconceptions about SOA plans. We frequently get the question, does my district need to develop a plan? We received relatively little or no additional Chapter 70 aid. The answer to this is yes. Plans are driven by your analysis of disparities for student groups, their underlying causes, and the evidence-based approaches you're going to use to address them. And there are gaps in learning experiences and outcomes for students with disabilities, English learners, students from low-income communities, and other student groups in most, if not all, districts across the Commonwealth. And it's our shared work to close these gaps. So every district in the Commonwealth is expected to develop and implement a plan, regardless of whether it receives no additional Chapter 70 aid, only a small amount, or a large amount of aid. The second misconception is that SOA plans focus largely on how districts are using their any additional Chapter 70 funds they get. Your plan will ask for investments. We'll go into more detail in that later, but it's looking at investments across all funding sources, and it's, I'm just going to say, put another way, the SOA plans aren't grants, and that's the way some districts have continued to look at them, even as we've tried to address this over time. We also want to highlight the distinction between SOA plans and district improvement plans, because we get a lot of questions about this from districts. The district improvement plan serves as a comprehensive plan, and it describes the full set of strategies that you're going to implement to support all of the students in your district. There's tremendous variation in the level of detail that districts include in their plans, and DESE does not collect these plans, and there's no common format that districts are expected to use, although they are admittedly used as data sources during periodic district reviews that the state conducts. By contrast, the SOA plan addresses a subset of your overall initiatives, focusing on specific evidence-based programs and strategies that will improve the educational experiences and outcomes of students, including English learners, students with disabilities, and low-income students, as well as other student groups. As you prepare your plan, you may actually find that when you do your analysis of disparities for student groups and their underlying causes, you may find that leads you to focus on EBPs that may not currently be part of your comprehensive district plan. We also want to acknowledge here, we know districts develop multiple plans for all kinds of purposes in addition to district improvement plans and SOA plans. These may be for title grants, other grant opportunities, if you're involved in any of our MTSS academies or other kinds of professional development opportunities. And they often involve engaging in many of the same processes: aggregated data analysis, stakeholder engagement, selection of evidence-based practices. We've already gotten questions from districts about whether they're expected to engage in a standalone process for developing their SOA plans. Our advice is that you use what you've learned as a launching point for developing your SOA plan. And they can any of work that you've done in those areas can certainly inform your SOA plan. But we ask you to please read the guidance carefully to ensure that you're fulfilling the requirements and expectations for SOA plans. As I said earlier, you may find that as you look at it, you may need to conduct additional analyses of disaggregated student data or the factors that contribute to disparities. And that was a really, really long way of saying it depends. Our hope is that districts will increasingly develop systemic approaches to analysis and other processes that they can leverage as they develop multiple plans over time, including their SOA plans, and that plans will align with one another. Moving on to a quick refresher on the SOA plan submission cycle. The first three bullets here describe the cycle for the first round of SOA plans, which of course was substantially impacted by COVID. The bottom half of the slide picks up with, with your FY24 plans, you'll be submitting your new plan in April 2024, and then in spring 25 and spring 26, you'll be expected to provide an update on the progress you're making and the kinds of outcomes that you're beginning to see for students, the student groups in your plans. And then the cycle begins again in April 2027. And we wanted to highlight that because it raises a third misconception on the part of some districts. These plans don't end once additional money is added, once the state finishes adding money in 2027. This cycle is written into the SOA legislation, and we expect it to continue indefinitely. Next on our agenda is the high-level overview of SOA plan elements and FY24 updates. Most of you who have done SOA plans in the past will find these look pretty familiar. We're going to ask you to summarize your district plan, analyze your data and select student groups for focused support, set some ambitious 3-year targets for improving student achievement, engage families, caregivers, and other stakeholders, and then select evidence-based programs and strategies to address disparities. I did want to briefly mention that we've changed the order. For those of you who've already reviewed the guidance we sent out earlier, the district summary, excuse me, is now first. This is typically what districts will read first. We also had to do this because of some programming issues with the data collection platform. So it appears first, even though you typically produce it last. And here are some new updates and some new features that we introduced this year. We've developed a new resource, the Student Outcomes Comparison School, which we'll discuss in a little more detail in a moment. We've set improvement targets for all districts, and districts will now be focusing on the lowest performing student groups. Evidence-based programs are now aligned with DESE's new education vision and strategic objectives. You will be submitting plans in the GEMS system beginning this year. We have a new resource that I want to highlight. We're not going to discuss it today, but we're pretty excited about adding it to our materials. Oh, so sorry. The SOA Plan Examples is a new resource that is going to be available hopefully towards the end of the week on our website or early next week. But we hope that it's a resource that you'll find useful as a companion piece to the guidance itself. We are going to be discussing the SOA Plan Addendum. A very few number of districts are going to be doing this. We are offering a separate webinar to cover the SOA Plan Addendum later this month, and we'll be reaching out to those 17 districts with additional information about that soon. Now we're going to dig in a bit to the submission guide. First, the 2-page submission guide appears on pages 6 to 7 of the FY24 SOA Plan guidance. I'm going to ask if Erica or Kinnan could drop a link into the most recent version of the guidance into the chat in case anyone wants to have it open as we walk through the different sections. I will mention briefly that because of programming in GEMS, we've needed to make some adjustments, and we will be posting at another update later this week, but those changes are really at the margins. They're pretty small changes. The template is organized into the 5 sections of the plan I walked through a moment ago, and each section describes the key planning steps you should take as you're thinking about them and developing those sections, and it includes details about the questions you'll be responding to in GEMS. Before we dig in, I just want to mention that if you hear me use the word template, I tend to use it interchangeably with plan submission guide. So just so you know that up front. The green highlighting on this page emphasizes section 1, which we're going to discuss first, which is summarizing your district plan. As I mentioned, this is the first thing that your stakeholders will read. It's intended to be a relatively high-level overview of what's in your district's SOA plan. You'll share in 1 to 2 paragraphs what student groups you're targeting, the evidence-based program your district is using to address the underlying factors contributing to disparities for these student groups, and the investments you plan to make in the EBPs over the next 3 years, and what's going to change in your district because of this plan. Section 2 focuses on analyzing data and selecting student groups. Your analysis of disparities and the exploration of underlying factors for those disparities is what ultimately drives the substance of your SOA plan. So your analysis of disparities in learning experiences and outcomes and the exploration, oh, I already said that, sorry. So broadly speaking, districts are being asked to do 2 things. We're asking districts to identify disparities in learning experiences and outcomes for student groups. This will entail looking at disaggregated data for students with disabilities, multilingual learners, economically disadvantaged students, students of color, It also entails looking beyond MCAS data to other kinds of outcomes, and this section gets at who has experienced gaps and on what measures, on what metrics. Step 2 is looking at the why by exploring underlying factors contributing to those disparities. This is sometimes referred to as a root cause analysis. And the types of data you might add to your exploration are things like instructional data, data you've collected on the student experience in the classroom, examining your curricular materials, observing instructional strategies. It can include perspectives data that allows you to hear from students and other stakeholders. You can have focus groups, for instance, or like the vocal data collection provides good information about student perspectives on their learning experiences. And finally, you could also include relevant systems information. So looking at the systems and structures that support students. Now we want to take a moment to describe some of the resources that will support you in doing this work. The first of these is the Student Outcomes Comparison Tool. This is a resource that districts can use to review data across student groups on critical indicators. You can use it to pinpoint where there are disparities in learning outcomes and where they're most prominent. We shared this link when the guidance was released. So, if anyone's taken a look at it, it would be nice to know if you've taken a look in chat and any questions you may already have. And we're also interested in knowing whether districts would be interested in having us run a standalone hands-on demo and Q&A session using the tool. Unfortunately, we won't have time for a demo during this overview, but we do want to take a few moments to highlight a few features. What you're looking at here is the district heat map feature. It includes an at-a-glance view of multiple indicators by student group. And these indicators include student achievement and growth, MCAS data, chronic absenteeism, out-of-school suspension rates, 9th grade course passing, and secondary pathways and program enrollment. And the way the table works, and down below, we have MCAS data for grades 3, 6, 8, and 10. And a heat map, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, is a graphical representation of data where values are depicted by color. Now, the top row of the data here is for all students in the district. And then for the MCAS, all students' information appears down here in the left-hand, this column that says all students. This is the comparison that's being made throughout the heat map. And it's cool to have all of the indicators on the same page at once. So you get this sort of at a glance view. Colors, like the blue, indicates places where a student group is at or the same value for whatever the measure is as all students in the district. The pink and red are places where a student group doesn't meet the all students rate. And the red, the dark red in particular, are the ones where they see the greatest disparities. This doesn't tell you that these are the students that you'll look at necessarily, but this is a starting point for a conversation about that. You'll need to spend time with your team to reflect on the extent to which the disparities are meaningful, like how big is the disparity. There are also additional tabs here that go into more detail for different student groups. So the English Learner tab, for instance, would have data on all of these indicators for English learners, and they would have them for 2 years and draw comparisons over 2 years for the student group and all students in the district. Again, this resource is intended to start a conversation. You know, where are you seeing the most substantial gaps? It's not the only data you look at. As most of you know, DESE has many different data resources that support data exploration, and they include things like tracking longer-term progress through DART tools and comparisons with other districts. We have the DART, district and school, the district analysis and report tools for districts and schools and for English learners and success after high school. There are also Edwin reports that include, student achievement, student learning experience, and the perspectives and vocal data are also available there. And your district will also have data that will be valuable in this analysis. I'm sorry to mess that up. And in terms of exploring the underlying causes of disparities, we have several resources that we think will be useful for districts that are looking at the causes of disparities for students. DESE's Coherence Guidebook contains information and resources on strategic planning for districts and schools. It's included here for a couple of reasons. It has a really useful reference about the different types of data that are useful in examining equity gaps in your school. And it includes the data I was talking about earlier, perspectives data, instructional data, systems data. It also includes the Equity Pause Protocol, and we put a link to that in this slide too, which is also available and is useful in discussing and exploring and identifying equity gaps for student groups in your district. And finally, Planning for Success, where you are posting a link to the Analyzing Data for Root Cause. It's a useful facilitation guide to help you work as a group to analyze data to understand these underlying factors or conditions leading to disparities. And these you can read in the plan submission guide itself, but these are the questions that, we're looking for robust information about the gaps you're seeing for student groups and your analysis of the underlying causes. These are both, the first one and the second are both open response, and you'll be writing about them in 2 separate places. And then finally, this is a checkbox where you'll just check off, based on your analysis, these are the student groups that we are particularly focusing on, and will provide focused support to them for rapid improvement over the next few years. Now, moving on to setting ambitious targets for 3-year improvement. This is required by the SOA legislation, and it's a requirement for the state as well as for individual districts. And it explicitly calls out setting achievement targets, which is why you'll see in a second that the Commissioner's Office has opted to use 3-year targets in ELA and math, both achievement targets for the lowest performing student group, for the lowest performing student group category, to look at progress in meeting targets at the state and district level. It streamlines the process for both districts and DESE. And by definition, the lowest performing student group includes students who currently have the lowest academic performance and therefore need the most significant levels of support to reduce disparities between their performance and that of their peers. This group typically includes substantial proportions of a district's high need population, as well as other student groups. The SOA guidance document includes a link to a resource that explains the rationale and methodology for the lowest performing student group accountability measure, and it streamlines, and it also includes a link to the security portal, which is where you can go to see what the composition of student groups in your lowest performing student group looks like. Districts also have the option of setting rigorous 3-year targets for a single student group if they want to. In that case, if you are going to use the 3-year improvement targets for math and ELA for the lowest performing student group, essentially all you need to do in the GEMS template is check a box. If you want to use other targets because of the EVPs that you're using and the student groups you're focusing on, maybe you're only focusing on a single student group, you will be able to do that. And there's an open-ended response box where you can describe the measures you're going to use and the targets that you're setting. Our accountability office tells us that they anticipate releasing the 3-year targets for individual districts late in January. And if it would be helpful, we're currently planning to just send an email to districts once they're posted with a link to where they're found on our website. As we mentioned earlier, our hope is that districts are increasingly taking systematic approaches to engaging families, stakeholders, caregivers in a variety of meaningful ways that support student needs and student learning. This green highlights the section of the template we're discussing now. Essentially, this question, the first question, refers to the broad and varied engagement of families and caregivers, not simply their engagement in the development and providing input into the SOA plan. In particular, it highlights steps your district takes to engage with the families and caregivers of the student groups experiencing the greatest disparities in your district. This second bullet, the legislation explicitly calls for districts to indicate how they plan to measure increases and improvements in engaging with families and caregivers, particularly those, for student groups experiencing disparities. There'll be a separate place for you to let us know what measure you'll be using, and we'll be asking you to provide an update on progress you're making in your FY25 and FY26 SOA progress reports. This section also asks you to describe the ways in which you engage different stakeholder groups, and then there's a section where you confirm that your district has engaged with specific stakeholders in developing the plan as described by law. This is just a screenshot mostly. Our Office of Student and Family Support web pages feature a number of family engagement resources. You know, this just shows their office and a link to one of their resources, the Better Together reusable learning object that's designed to help districts engage with the family, school, and community partnership fundamental self-assessment that some of you may be familiar with. We do get questions from districts as to whether they need to begin a whole new process for engaging stakeholders if they've done it previously. Again, I'm going to say you can leverage what you've done earlier, but you may find that you still need to reach out to stakeholders who are closely connected to the student groups represented in your plans to get their perspectives. This may be students themselves or the families and caregivers, community groups that work with the populations that you serve or partner with them. So you can leverage this, but you still may need to do some outreach for your SOA plan itself. And for stakeholders, we're looking for efforts that are described more than just informing and updating different groups about what you're doing. Once, sometimes we get descriptions that look like they only shared it with stakeholders at the very end of the process. So we're looking for opportunities that stakeholders have had to provide input and feedback in a time frame that allows for their input and feedback to be incorporated into the plan. And there's not a single way of doing this. We mentioned earlier, perspectives data from different stakeholder groups, from focus groups and surveys. It's also, there's also, if your district is at the visioning stage, there's a pretty cool planning for success and visioning the future protocol, sometimes called the Back to the Future protocol. And there's a link to that in the guidance. There are also districts that set up separate planning teams, community engagement that include broad stakeholder engagement over time, not necessarily just for the SOA, that allows them to have deeper engagement in the planning process for districts. And here we're just asking, we're also going to ask how you're continuing to engage stakeholders throughout the implementation of your plan and how their perspectives are integrated into the plan that we're seeing. Just quickly, who do we mean by stakeholders? This is a complete list. The ones highlighted in blue are ones that are emphasized by the SOA legislation itself, but we think the ones in black are also important to include, to meaningfully include in the process. And then at the end of the section I mentioned earlier, there's going to be like affirmations, we're calling it, where it's stakeholders. You check off whether you included the stakeholders that were in blue on the previous slide were engaged. The legislation calls for the superintendent to consult with the school committee on the SOA plan. So you're going to be asked to confirm that the school committee has voted to approve the plan. This is just a checkbox, and then the date of the vote was taken. We're going to ask you to check your school committee calendars now to ensure that the school committee vote takes place before the April deadline. And I am now going to hand over the presentation to Kinnan Foley to discuss the selection of evidence-based programs to address disparities in outcomes.
Thanks, Karen. So in this section, the final section of your plan submission, you will provide additional details about the specific EBPs you are selecting for your new 3-year plan. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So one key update for this year is the alignment of the evidence-based programs to DESE's new educational vision and strategic objectives. We received a lot of feedback from districts that indicated that previous year EBPs kind of felt like a hodgepodge of initiatives. So we're really excited to ground them in this new framework. We also received feedback from districts on the varying grain size of the different EBPs. Some were incredibly broad and others were very specific. So that is another fix that we hope you'll see reflected in the new version. Next slide. So what does this look like? The strategic objectives table that now includes the EBPs can be found on pages 10 through 13 of the guidance. The table includes the strategic objective, the focus areas under the strategic objective, the aligned evidence-based programs, and then some suggested metrics, both local metrics and DESE provided metrics. This is an example of the SO1, strategic objective 1, the whole student table. Go to the next slide. Just a few additional resources before we talk about how you will describe your EBPs in your plan. First is that we have updated our How Do We Know website from our Office of Planning and Research to reflect the analysis we have done to highlight the programming and strategies that are most likely to have the greatest impact on students. This is linked as a resource in the guidance document. And you can see an example of the strategic objective focus area 1.1, promoting students' physical and mental health and wellness, and the focus area evidence base and links on the right-hand side. Go to the next slide. The second resource that I want to point out is a crosswalk. The evidence-based program categories were actually categories that were included in the law, in the language of the law. So on page 9 of the guidance, you will find a crosswalk of the EBPs to those SOA program categories that are as required by law. I also want you all to know that all previous years' EBPs that were of varying grain sizes are all represented in our new table. So we also have a crosswalk of that. Next slide. So how will districts indicate their EBP selections in the new plan submission guide? You can advance the slide, Karen. Thank you. So first, you'll review the strategic objectives table and description on pages 9 through 13 of the guidance. Then you'll be asked to select 1 to 3 focus areas that your district will prioritize over the next 3 years for your plan. And then for each focus area, you will select 1 or more of the EBPs from our provided list. Once you select your EBPs, you will be prompted to answer a number of additional questions, which I'll share in a minute, and I'm sure you've seen in the guidance about each EBP you select, including questions about resource allocation and metrics. Some districts have asked whether or not they need to start from scratch or whether they can continue with the same EBPs from their first original plan. And our response to that is that if your analysis of disparities for student groups and their underlying causes suggests that those are still the right evidence-based programs to focus on, the answer is yes, you can continue with the same evidence-based programs. So here on this slide, you can see an example. If you were to select the focus area 2.1 on selecting and skillfully implementing high quality and engaging instructional materials, and perhaps then you selected 2.1C, a comprehensive approach to early literacy. You can go to the next slide. Then for that EBP that you selected, you will answer a number of additional questions. So first, you'll provide a short description of what your district has in place now related to this EBP, and also what you anticipate will be implemented by the end of the 3-year plan. You will also indicate which schools will be impacted by these efforts, and the answer can be district-wide. You will then answer 3 questions around resource allocation. First being, what is the anticipated amount of total funding that will be allocated to this EBP over the next 3 years, fiscal year 25, 26, and 27, across all funding sources? This will be a numerical response, and we are asking that districts include, again, as Karen referenced earlier in the presentation, all funding sources, excluding ESSER, as ESSER, all funding sources excluding ESSER. Next, you will describe the anticipated allocation of funds, this EBP, in more detail. You may include programs that you are adopting, staff you are hiring, vendors that you plan to contract with, materials you plan to purchase aligned to the evidence-based program. All of this in more detail. And then, as required by law, there will be a drop-down with a checkbox of the foundation categories, and you will indicate which foundation categories are included in this EBP. It might be classroom teacher salaries. It might be professional development, instructional materials and equipment, etc. And lastly, you will select metrics that your district will use to monitor progress in this EBP. I want to highlight, this is a screenshot from one of our sample plans that will be posted later this week. I wanted to highlight just those last 4 questions. And we encourage you to use the example plans as a reference as you are completing. So here, this district, the first fiscal question is just a numerical response. What is the total amount of funding that will be allocated to this EBP over the next 3 years? And that is a cumulative amount. And then this sample district describes the anticipated allocation of funds. They will be dedicating $350,000 to professional development, a number of salaries on there, classroom and specialist teachers, instructional materials, equipment, and technology, and their total $2.35 million for early literacy programming. This is an example of 2.1C, which we just talked about, the comprehensive approach to early literacy. And this again will be a drop down, but they selected those 4 foundation budget categories as a part of their anticipated annual allocation. So the last thing we'll say about the EBP is that we have 2 sample plans, again, coming out later this week. We encourage you to reference those as you think about your plan and to explore the guidance in more detail and reach out with any questions that you may have. And with that, I'll turn it back to Karen for DESE supports for plan development and submission.
Thank you, Kenan. We mentioned earlier that plans are going to be submitted in GEMS this year, and while it's the programming of the template is entering the final phases of development, we do have a couple of, we can't show it to you live, but we have a couple of screenshots. We do currently, barring any complications, we currently anticipate opening it up to districts late in January, and we will keep you posted on the timing for that. Now, I know that GEMS is DESE's new grant system, but I just want to emphasize again for the record that SOA plans are not grants, even though we're leveraging our grant system to collect this information. And we want to give you a brief look at what to expect when you go into GEMS and highlight some of the advantages we think GEMS has over Alchemer, which is the system we've used to collect SOA plans and updates up until now. First, your GEMS administrator will assign 2 roles, an SOA plan writer and an SOA plan approver in GEMS. There won't be any more unique sign-in links to get into and then back into your district's plan. I'm a little jazzed about this because I used to get a lot of the emails saying, I can't get into my plan, how do I get back in? So that is, we think is going to be a game changer in a lot of ways. You're also, and maybe more importantly to you, you are going to be able to complete the sections of your plan in any order. And I have a screenshot of what the plan will look like in GEMS. And if you want to start off with setting ambitious timelines or engaging families, you can click on that and work on it. You don't have to finish it. You can leave and come back later. In Alchemer, as some of you may recall, you couldn't advance to the next section until the previous section was complete. So we think this will be a game changer as well. This is a screenshot of one of the data entry pages, and some of you may know this already if you've been submitting grants in GEMS, but GEMS permits you to format your narratives, which neither Alchemer nor Power BI, where we subsequently displayed your information from your plans, neither of them allowed formatting. And you can see that here there's a formatting bar that looks like the same thing that you see in Word. You'll be able to format if you're typing in within the GEMS system. Now, not every formatting feature is available within GEMS, but you can copy and paste text, including link and tables into GEMS. You're also going to be able to print out a copy of your submission, either by section or in its entirety from the GEMS system. We will once again be offering SOA office hours. You'll be able to schedule half-hour consultations using, I have this link here, but the link is on our website. Was in some of the materials we sent to you. Typically, we'll have about six hours a week in half-hour increments that are set aside, and you can just click on it and we'll set up a time to talk. No questions too small. I've had like wonderful long conversations with districts about their plans, and sometimes districts have simply hopped on to say, am I doing this right? And we're done in like 5 to 10 minutes. Whatever the question is, feel free to consult us using that feature. You can also email questions to us at any time at soaplans@mass.gov. Districts, and I don't know if there are any districts here today that will be completing the SOA plan addendum. We will be getting information to you soon. The addendum itself, along with the guidance for completing it, sometime later this month. We're also hosting a separate webinar for those districts at the end of the month. And at that time, we'll share additional supports that those 17 districts can expect to receive from the department to assist them with developing the addendum. I did want to mention, I don't have it written down here, but reading the Commissioner's Weekly Update, we often put updates when we introduce a new resource or we're planning some kind of outreach to districts. Occasionally we do send like Dear District Leader emails as well. I wanted to take a moment to just, before we go to the next section, to ask you what other kinds of supports would be useful to you at this time. We asked earlier about a separate webinar, for instance, to walk people through the new student outcomes comparison tool. Other things that come to mind include like a GEMS, like submitting your plans in GEMS. I'm not sure that would be necessary or if written guidance would be enough. But please take a moment now to put any suggestions into chat. So I did want to briefly mention, your plan submitted, now what happens? Between April and June, plans will be reviewed by members of the SOA team and perhaps other people within DESE who we reach out to look at different pieces of the plans. We expect the review at this point to focus on whether plans meet statutory requirements, their responsiveness to the prompts that were asked in the template. And what I didn't mention earlier, and maybe I should have when I was doing the GEMS highlights, was to mention that any questions we have, any feedback or requests for additional information will be communicated via the GEMS system. The SOA legislation also requires the state to publicly make SOA plans publicly available. We've been doing it in the past through the Power BI dashboard, the SOA dashboard, beginning with FY24 plans. We will be making them publicly available through GEMS. And we will get back to you with additional information about what this will look like in February, but we did want to give you a little heads up now that this would be coming. Here, in addition to the SOA plans at mass.gov, here is contact information for the SOA plan team, myself, Erica Champagne, and Kinnan Foley, who presented some parts of this, and the two of them have been answering your questions throughout. And amazingly enough, we've finished this in time to give folks an opportunity if they have any questions that have not yet been answered by Kinnan and Erica, or that they wanted to mention to, I would invite you to raise your hand.
Karen, I have a few in the chat that I would like to get answered here before we close out. So one just technical question I promised we would answer was, can you have multiple users identified as SOA plan writers within GEMS?
I will have to check on that, but my understanding is no.
So it's just one
Believe
writer, one approver. That's our understanding. Thank you for confirming that. We had several folks asking where they can find their Chapter 70 allocations. I have put a link in a couple times to our Chapter 70 webpage where you can get that type of information and also get some assistance in locating that if you can't find it easily. And then also was hoping that Karen, you could reiterate, there's a couple questions here that were discussed at the beginning of the presentation around do districts that do not get a substantial increase in Chapter 70 funding still need to write an SOA plan? You said that so beautifully at the beginning. I'll let you restate that for us here.
Let's see if I can do it without a script. The short answer to that is yes. Every district and charter school in the state writes an SOA plan. You lead with the gaps that you're seeing in your district. Every district, you know, it's written into on the policy side as an affirmation or a commitment to closing gaps for students throughout the state. It's not related to how much money you get. It doesn't matter whether you got $0 additional dollars or a lot of, you know, or you're at the opposite end. You know, one of the reasons we have the 17 districts doing the addendum is because there is an interest on the part of our stakeholders, including the legislature, some of our external advocacy groups, and in DESE. It's like, are these funds making a difference in the districts that are getting the most money? What's been transformational about that for districts? But every district typically has gaps for some of its student groups. And these plans are designed to simply hone in on where you're seeing disparities for students and say, how are we addressing this? What does our data analysis tell us are the underlying causes of those gaps? And we're asking you not to make assumptions about it, but to speak to what your root cause analysis tells you about the reasons for those disparities. And then think about the EVPs. Which EVPs are going to do the most to help reduce those disparities for those student groups? Your district improvement plan is your comprehensive plan for all students. You know, we know districts are, your goal is to improve outcomes for every student in the district. Your SOA plan is designed to reduce disparities. I don't know if this is going to work. You know, we want to see gaps do this, close for students. I'm not that great at hand puppets either. But hopefully that visual was helpful. And I know Erica has put the amount of funding that districts, you know, she's put links to the Chapter 70 for districts who are interested in how much additional funding they get. But again, I do want to say that this is about like what are you investing in the strategies you're using to close gaps for students. We know that not every strategy costs a lot of money. You may be redeploying some of your staff and you know, supporting implementation in different ways. We want to know about that. It's like, what are you going to be doing differently to support students experiencing disparities, and what is going to look different in 3 years? It's a narrower focus than your broader district improvement plan.
So there are several questions that I'm going to try to get to. One is, can and should charter schools be opting into your office hours now, or is there another time and/or process for them to access support?
You know, we probably have the bandwidth to have a conversation with charter schools now. Technically, charters, even though we had the April 1 date up, charter school plans aren't technically due until August 1st. And I should have mentioned that earlier. And we have been communicating with charter schools that we're looking for, charter schools can start entering them as soon as April 1st, which is the date that others, we're closing the, submission window, the end of the submission window for other districts in the state. But we're looking for charter schools to submit between April 1st and August 1st. I would also recommend reaching out to Allison Bagg and the school, the charter school office. I don't know if Allison's here today. Erica. Her office often likes to do the one-on-one interaction with their charter school leaders and others who are developing plans.
I do not see Allison specifically in this webinar. I also realized that just a quick caveat, Karen's, been clear on the SOA plan is not a one-to-one. How are you spending any additional Chapter 70 money that you are getting through the new funding formula? However, lots of you do want to know how much money do we have in Chapter 70? Where do I find that information? And I had put a link in to our general Chapter 70 funding page, but I'm about to drop another link that gives you really the most up-to-date posting. It's back from August of 23, and you should keep an eye out on that main page for any additional postings. Our finance office is frequently updating this information. And I'll put a link in that if you go to the bottom of the page, you'll see something that says summary chart, and that is a place where you should be able to download a pretty comprehensive spreadsheet that gives by district information about Chapter 70 funding.
Actually, Erica, can I just, it's actually the complete formula spreadsheet file that's going to be the most useful.
Sorry. Thank you.
Let me just drop it into chat. If I can find my chat feature.
Are you going to put just the spreadsheet in?
I'm just going to put the spreadsheet in.
Okay.
Hold on a second.
All right. Should districts, I'll just try to answer a couple questions while you add that link.
Okay.
So should districts make SOA plans publicly available on district websites? Yes, that is an expectation that your plans are accessible to your stakeholders in your community. And I'm still scrolling just to make sure I don't miss any big questions. I think I've covered everything that's in the chat. We're at time. So if Karen has dropped in the link, you can access some of your funding there. I see a comment about, will supervisory districts be able to submit after April 1st? I
will have to check on the answer to that and get back to you.
We'll have to get back to you on that one. And I will make a note of the person asking that question. Thank you. So, okay.
I thought I saw a question. Was it answered about which districts are completing the addendum?
Yes, Kenan gave a, it's in the guidance document, that list is there. And if anyone has any additional questions, Karen in the presentation gave some of our contact information and also the general SOA plan email address. Feel free to send those in and we'll get responses out to folks. And you'll also have this PowerPoint presentation and recording available to you.
And I'm going to make, before I say goodbye and sign off, I'm going to make a pitch for sending it to the SOA Plans at mass.gov email, simply because that's like a place where all of our emails for the SOA are. I'm usually the person who reads, monitors the mailbox and responds to them. So you're essentially emailing me when you send something to that. You can also send it to me, but it saves me from having to forward it. That's just you don't need to worry about that. Thank you so much, everyone. Is there anyone who wanted to make, from my team, who wanted to make any final comments before we sign off? Looks like people are.
One thing I could just address, if the comment about the supervisory union extension was about, sort of the supervisory districts, like consolidated districts, there are no extensions for any districts. All districts need to submit by April 1st, with the exception of charter schools.
And I have a copy of the chat. I will do my best to reach out to everyone who put questions in the last few minutes or that maybe weren't addressed and get back to you this week. If I don't get back to you, please send me an email. Thank you, everyone.